It was a very, very friendly neighborhood. Everyone watched out for everyone else. Everyone knew everyone else.
Everyone in the neighborhood was very friendly. They would do anything for each other. There was an open door policy. No one had to knock. You came over for a glass of wine, a cup of coffee. Everyone helped each other.
And obviously, people watch out for each other and take care of each other, and that's what this neighborhood originally was.
Life was very comfortable in terms of closeness and support for each other.
The Italians came from Rose, Italy, and Cosenza, and they all came to Greenwich, first of all, and they either settled in Greenwich or they started to move outward, like in Darien or in Stamford. But like my grandfather, they came to Greenwich here in Bible Street because that's where the Italian population was, and that's where they settled for a while until they figured out where the jobs were.
The real Italian, we used to call it the garlic belt, Bible Street and Coscob Avenue. That was the epicenter of the Italian community in Coscob.
Growing up in Coscob on Valley Road was strictly Italian, Rose Italian neighborhood. We all lived in close proximity to each other with small pieces of property. I think ours was one of the largest.
It was a walking community. People didn't use cars and everybody knew everybody. You didn't lock your doors because there was no need to. And if you got out of line, if you started to cause trouble, well, the neighbors knew who you were. Either they came and give you a smack behind the head, or they called your parents, and you got it smacked behind the head when you got home. So
we used to walk back and forth from Coscob School, and we used to cut, we didn't take the street, we cut through everybody's backyard, we'd hop the fences. I'd go all the way from, I'd go through Bible Street, go through that way, come the back way through Bible Street, go through Coscob Avenue, climb up, go Harold Street, go up through my aunt's, and we all cut through everybody's yards. They all knew us. We never did anything horrible or anything, so they knew. And if you did anything wrong, they would call before you even got home. They would know, walking. I remember as a teenager walking along Post Road, and my mother never wanted me to be on the Post Road ever, and I just happened to be on the Post Road, and they would say, I would get home and they'd say, oh, so you were on the Post Road and you weren't supposed to be on the Post Road, because even though I didn't know them, they knew me.
the neighborhood was a tight-knit community. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody shared everything with everybody.
Chickahominy was a little bit more widespread. You had Hamilton Avenue, you had St. Roch's Avenue, and there were a lot of other streets around there, all the way down to Arnold's Bakery. So Coscob was a little bit more concentrated. Chickahominy is a word that was taken from a battle in the Civil War. I don't recall how it got to be here, but that's the origin of the word Chickahominy. The symbol of Chickahominy is an Indian. The symbol of Coscob is an Indian. So whenever I wear a shirt, a Coscob shirt, and it has an Indian on it, some of my friends from Chickahominy will say, "Oh, you guys stole it," in a joking way. But it's very, very, there's a lot of similarities there.
My grandfather, I remember, anytime he went to visit, he always put on a jacket and tie. He always brought candy or flowers for the lady of the house, and he always brought a bottle of liquor or a bottle of wine for whoever it was that he was going to visit.
I grew up on Apache Place in Riverside, and I never realized until I got older that it was an immigrant settlement.
We used to have lots of houses here that were occupied by 3 generations of the family at the same time.
And my grandmother's house, I discovered as I got older, I met a number of people that said, I lived in your grandmother's house. And I said, how did you live in my grandmother's house? Well, they did temporarily until they bought their own house. So my grandparents were probably older than the others, and they were there first.
Those days are gone.
Whenever some man in the neighborhood had some kind of a job or a task doing something, other men in the neighborhood would come around and somehow it's like, well, what are you doing? And then it would become like a project.
And all the moms, they were always together because that was a generation where typically moms weren't working like they are today. It's a complete different economic times.
Large families were there to help. It was a very, very good bond. And more than anything is there was a lot of love, a lot of care, and a lot of help.
Our neighbor, Dominic Chiapetta, they call him Popeye, had this huge rock that was between our yard and his yard. And he had a nephew. I mean, we knew the whole family, his extended family, and his nephew decided, you know what? Why do we have this rock? Let's get rid of this rock. We can blast this rock. Let's get rid of the rock. And yeah, that would be better. We wouldn't need this rock. It's in the way. And so they all decided, it became a project. Like my grandfather got sledgehammers, and that was difficult. And then they started, and then I watched all of this as a child, just watching this. And I remember them pouring water. There was like, they had problems with it wasn't breaking right, and they decided to pour water on the rock. And when they poured the water on the rock could break easier for some reason. So they knew about this, and they would pour the water in, and then they would slug it again, and they had chisels and everything, and they finally, got rid of the rock. So, and it became this, it started with one person, and then two, and then three, and then people heard like the clanging, and they what are you doing? What's going on? And then they came over and they're talking, you want a drink, have this, have that.
One day I was walking home from school and I come home and there's a bucket loader in the driveway. I'm like, what's going on? Well, it seems that Charlie had a job across the street, so he had to go across the street to say hello to Aunt May, because that's just the rules. And of course, next thing I know, my mother's got his whole crew in the house. She's making them lunch and all that.
And as kids, we would all be like fascinated. We would just hear all the conversation, unedited and, colorful conversation. We heard all of that. So that was always really special. You don't hear those kinds of conversations. Those things are edited now for children. And
It's just, it was family. I don't see that as much anymore.
We went out and played after supper Ringalivio and kicked the can and bore a hole in the old man's back. But that's what we did. We played outside a lot. So we had very good times. We didn't go anywhere or do any traveling or anything, but we had a lot of fun and a lot of people around all the time. It was just an awful lot of love in the family.
My grandfather Ladonia came, when he came through Ellis Island, he went to Pennsylvania where he had cousins. I'm assuming that you had to be sponsored by someone in order to get in. And he had cousins in Pennsylvania and went and worked in the coal mines. And I believe he was about 12 years old at that point. And ended up in Greenwich because he came to visit another cousin who lived in Riverside, Rocco DeAndrea, and came here and decided he was not going back to the coal mines because Greenwich looked a lot sweeter than the coal mines of Pennsylvania. It's been a commercial area since George Washington rode his horse down Valley Road, because this was the post road. If you look on some of the historical maps of the town of Greenwich, you will see that the current East Putnam Avenue or Post Road, whatever you'd like to call it, used to end at the Mianus River, because the only way that you could cross the Mianus River was on the North Mianus Bridge that goes over Palmer Hill. So this was actually the Boston Post Road. So it has a long commercial history.
The area itself in North Mianus was the first business district of the town of Greenwich for the first 100 years. And there were a grist mill, 2 taverns, and a way station. It was the original route to Boston.
We were the third family of Italian descent to settle in Old Greenwich in Riverside.
Now, my grandfather Dolcetti came here in 1906, and we are now the oldest family in Darien. We're in the 5th generation of Dolcettis.
My father started a business. He was very industrious. He built houses as a contractor. He'd build a house, we'd move into it, live a year maybe, he'd sell it. We'd move on, build another house.
My grandfather came in 1920, made enough money to bring his family over the following year,
Then he opened a shoemaker store in Byram, Connecticut. My grandfather was known as the Byram Cobbler. He made shoes from scratch. He was one of the only few that were left to do such.
My grandfather was employed as a gardener on several of the fine estates in Greenwich, including that of Alec Templeton. He was a composer and pianist. And my grandmother was a wonderful cook. She was encouraged to open a little restaurant, which she did in the late 1920s. The name of the restaurant was the Dewdrop Inn. It was located on West Putnam Avenue between Victoria Street, now known as Josephine Evaristo Avenue, and Melrose Avenue. And she served traditional Italian food, pasta fagioli, meatballs, and macaroni, as it was called then, pizza, which she baked in a brick oven. We're just very happy to have these Demitasse cup from my grandma's restaurant. It was quite a charming little place, I understand.
When they came here, they lived in a patchy place right down the road, where they still had dirt floors and everything. And my grandfather was born there in 1912, first generation American. He went into fight for the United States in World War II, and when he came back in 1947, he started a civil engineering business, which still exists today, which is owned and operated by my two uncles and my mother. It's definitely a family operation, and all the employees we've employed there, they've been there for forever, so they're like a second family as well, and it really is just a tribute to my grandfather's dream to achieve something more.
They were very, very talented. They had to be plumbers, electricians, carpenters, painters. They fixed cars. The men in that era, all of them, they did everything because they had to. They didn't have money, and they probably, and somehow they learned how to do it.
The Caruso side were here in the early 1900s. He married Caroline Smeriglio and had several children, 13 I believe, or 14. And unfortunately, 3 of them died in the influenza, 2 within the same week.
My great-grandparents died very young in the great epidemic. And what I've heard was over 200 people died in Coscop from that epidemic.
They had their farm and raising the children. My mother used to drive a truck and go pick up hay for the animals. Learned how to drive standard shift at probably 13, 14 years old. Besides their farm, they also were in the ash business, which is basically now called the garbage business. Before that, people used to burn all of their foods and organics for food for garden, but anything paper was burnt in potbelly stoves. He then basically used part of the garbage business, servicing places such as Pepperidge Farm, Arnold Baker, and would take all the stale breads and bring them back and feed them to his hogs. Probably had 200 or 300 pigs here right on Coscop Avenue. We owned over 14, 15 acres there on Coscop Avenue, probably more than all the other houses put together on the street. We never ate anything to store and was basically raised with garden vegetables, from jarring to canning to jelly to eating pig's feet to milk and goats to butchering rabbits. Joseph Santaguida, basically a hard laborer, hod carrier, helped build the original Coscop School and the City Hall in Stamford as a hod carrier.
I know men that were masons that cut stone with a hammer and chisel, and they built dry walls. A dry wall that affected the difference between a wet wall. The wet wall you'd have cement, so the stone didn't have to fit so perfect when you made the wall. And these Italians would sit there chipping away and hammering away and cutting, and they fit the stone and make beautiful stone walls and beautiful lines and design. And everyone had its own characteristic.
Work became plentiful. All the back country of Greenwich was built on the backs of these immigrants who came, most of them from Italy. And all the stone walls you see up there, that not a recent time, were all built by those gentlemen.
And I was amazed on how every tops were always nice and even.
He could grade like no one could grade. Level off properties. The surveyor would take a look at it and say it's almost perfect. I've heard them say it even as I became an adult.
Came the end of October, November, we used to be very cold here in New England. And of course there was no work for my dad and his fellow workmen.
In those days, the winters that we had, I mean, the ice, all the ponds were frozen solid for months. All the guys that worked in construction would go home and stay home for 3 months because the ground was 3 feet of frost.
He was laid off until February or March. Well, he had three sons, and we were all old enough to go and peddle newspapers. I was 6.5 years old when I started my first paper excursion. We did, my older brother, myself, and my younger brother, we all collected 20, 30 cents a day. You could buy meat for 15 cents a pound. Fruit and vegetables were inexpensive, so we helped subsidize the family income. Then came 1929, where Dad was out of work for quite a long time. Didn't have any money basically. Only what he could do when he worked a day here or a day there to pay for some of the expenses, but not enough. They had a one-family house. They converted to a two-family for some income, but it wasn't enough in those days to pay the mortgage and all the expenses. So they lost the house. And as time went by, the gentleman who bought it came to my dad and said, "Patsy, I'm going to sell the house. If you want to buy it back, I will sell it to you," which was the sweetest music for any two people. Because now they bought their original home back, the old homestead. And as we speak today, it's still in the family. And my daughter owns it now. So we've kept it in the family all that time.
My grandfather, during the Depression, when no one had any money, he would recycle, sell his recyclables there, and have enough money to go back and would give it to other families. And I heard that a lot of the immigrants there did that at the time. There was more of a communal spirit to help people until they get back on their feet. When their shoes went, they didn't get a new pair of shoes, they would stick newspapers in it to clog up the hole. And those shoes had to last. They didn't have any choice. And if the soles went, the women in the family would make the soles, make them work. So however they did that. So it's interesting how they learned to survive and to sustain themselves.
My father actually was sort of unique in that time. He was back in the 1920s. He was probably the first one in the neighborhood. He went to college.
My second oldest brother met a family challenge at that time because after high school, he thought he would like to go on to college to become an engineer.
Not only went to college, he went to an Ivy League school, which was very, very unusual, but he had a great mentor in Pop Folsom, who was the principal at the high school.
But at that time, if one wanted to give thought to going to college, there was a risk that you might be considered a playboy. And the original ethnic families didn't have the resources to support the young people going off to college.
You know, no one really went to college then. It was our generation, the first to go to school.
It was a combination of family resources, the student earning his own money, and doing that through college as well. And my brother did that by organizing an orchestra. He played the guitar, the banjo, and surrounded himself with 8 other musicians. And the group became known as the Royal Caledonians, and played in jobs around here, played at school where he was.
So that got my father into college, and then he went on and he was in the plumbing and heating business in Greenwich. He had a very successful business. He was vice president of Greenwich Hospital, so he did a lot of things in the town. I became involved in politics and government too. We both were elected officials in the town. And between the two of us, we each put in about 50 years' time in the town and town government. I ended up on the Board of Estimate for 20 years. I was a selectman for 9 years in the town. So, you know, our family has hopefully done a lot of good for the town of Greenwich over the years.
My grandfather, Siciliano, was the superintendent of the Putnam Cemetery in Greenwich and worked there for, I think, more than 50 years. My grandfather, Ladonia, was a caretaker on properties throughout the town. He worked for the Watsons when they founded IBM. He grew prize roses for a lady named Pathy who lived on Frost Lane. She would win prizes every year for the roses that my grandfather grew in her garden. And he was known throughout the neighborhood as the person he could grow anything. And if you had a plant that was dying, our backyard was always full of dying plants because they would bring them to my house and my grandfather would bring them back to life.
My oldest brother married the second oldest of the Belmont girls.
Belmont's had a grocery store, and next door to that was the feed place.
That became a congregating point for wives during the day and during the week to meet as they shopped for their groceries. The Belmont family, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Belmont, had 9 daughters, and my brother married the second oldest and married into the family which had originally started an ethnic grocery store in Mianus, supporting all of the families in the area that had come to the New World.
He had a grocery store, and then later on he expanded his business to a feed company, because there was so many animals and so many farms up in the northern part of Greenwich.
The Belmont Ethnic Store branched out into livestock supplies, grains, fertilizers, dairy supplies, and my brother had the privilege of running and operating that segment of the business and later became the owner of that business.
The other corner was Peter Bruno, which was a grocery store, and he ran that for quite a while, but later his sons expanded into supermarkets. The Bruno's Tavern didn't last too long, but it goes way back to the 1915. Then it became a barber shop and a stationery store and a gas station, and then all was taken away again, and it was bought by Lupinacci, and he had a restaurant there, and now it's a restaurant again. Cardillo leases the place, and he has a restaurant across the street. The flower shop lasted for a long, long time. That's my grandfather's place, and he started originally with his sons in landscaping, and then it finally went into what they call Frank Marzullo and Sons Greenhouse and Florist.
My mother and father's wedding. It was the biggest Italian-American wedding in Greenwich at the time, 1928. My grandfather built a dance platform 30 by 40 out of lumber so people could dance, okay? There were 500 people that came to the wedding. It was a huge affair. I'm proud to say that I was born 9 months later. So I'm a honeymoon baby. The Greenwich Police Department would have their annual clam bake on our property. And there wasn't a weekend that would go by from May to October where we didn't have visitors every weekend. It was just a tremendous holiday. Every weekend was just so festive.